big dream, big hope. It was a very romantic period.
This year, 17 African nations mark 50 years of independence from decades of European colonialism. One continent hungry for another's riches.
European imperialism in Africa set up the continent to be raped, its resources just sucked out.
The dreams of the independence era were to be short-lived.
The initial euphoria disappeared very, very quickly, within a year, maybe 2 years.
This is a story of mass exploitation, of the ecstasy of independence, and of how, with liberation, a new scramble for resources was born. Whether in bustling cities or remote villages, the 1880s and 90s were years of terrifying upheaval in Africa.
People were killed. Villages were destroyed. Political systems were completely destroyed. Leaders were arrested, put in jail.
Fleet upon fleet of foreign soldiers armed with new weaponry and a sense of entitlement descended as if overnight.
That was traumatizing.
This was a face of their European trading partners people had rarely seen. United in their cause, but divided in their efforts, armed resistance failed. In the space of just 20 years, 90% of Africa was brought under European occupation. Europe had captured a continent.
Gunboat diplomacy. In many instances, the British did not actually have to go to war. Just the threats of war, the fact that there were all these big, powerful guns, was enough to force the local chiefs to sign a treaty.
All this because of massive sea changes. Not in Africa itself, but in Europe, which was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. The advent of the machine was transforming the continent into the workshop of the world. A workshop in need of raw materials. Palm and peanut oil would literally grease the engines of the revolution. Modern transportation would need rubber for tires, and Europe's prosperous middle classes now demanded luxuries from overseas. This was the dawn of industrial-scale production, modern capitalist economies, and mass international trade. Thanks to a generation of explorers and traders, the great powers knew what riches lay in Africa. Britain and France already controlled most of the continent's ports.
Africa had diamonds, it had gold, it had cobalt, it had lots of things. It had cocoa. It had lots of things that Europe needed.
But in the new industrial era, the value of Africa rocketed, not only for materials and strategic trade routes, but also as a market for the goods it now produced in bulk. Africa was an opportunity.
The Africans wanted to trade right from the word go. They wanted to sell their labor. From Malawi and northern Rhodesia, they used to go down into South Africa. You had a movement of people. People wanted to learn. They wanted to meet each other. So it was a natural thing that the outside world should get involved with Africa.
But the scramble for Africa wasn't just about economics. Colonialism had become the fast track to political supremacy in Europe. Britannia may have ruled the waves, but Germany was rising after victory in the Franco-Prussian War. Meanwhile, the defeated French Empire sought to regain its glory, and a new unified Italy was also growing in strength. Europe was a continent in the ascendancy, whose nations were vying for supremacy. And back in Africa, their competing imperial armies were pushing inland. And this looked set to bring them into major confrontation. The rival powerful powers convened around a conference table in the German capital, and in February 1885 signed the Act of Berlin, an agreement to abolish slavery and allow free trade. But the Act also drew new borders on the map of Africa, awarding territory to each European power and turning trading partners into subjects of empire. It legalized the scramble for Africa.
What it did was it carved up what were what are thought to have been about between 6,000 and 10,000 political units in Africa, and they were then carved up, often cutting peoples in half, water tables just sort of cut off from their sources. It was complete geographical madness. Simply drew lines on the map, places where they had not even been yet. They had no idea what was there.
Africans were not aware that there were conferences being organized in Berlin to determine about them. No, they did not know about it. They only saw the consequences.
But the governments of Europe were at pains to stress that their forays into Africa weren't just the product of vested interest. That beneath train tracks and shipping lanes lay a moral justification which caught the public imagination.
And they justified it by saying that they were bringing civilization and Christianity to these benighted, primitive people.
A white man's burden. Beautiful language. So the European politicians are the theoretician of colonialism to explain to their people why should we send our children to Tonkin, the Gulf of Tonkin, to Vietnam? Why should we send them to die in the malaria-infested part of Algeria or Black Africa and so on? White man's burden. We have to bring them the light.
A partnership with the church in Africa offered the colonialists an insight into living conditions and the social services that would be expected of a supposedly benevolent empire. But it also delivered a moral pretext. Europe had long harbored an image of the dark continent, wild, exotic, and in need of enlightenment. For Christian missionaries and for many colonialists, their project was a humanitarian one.
I didn't see the colonial service as racist. After all, I'd come across real racism in southern Rhodesia and South Africa. Well, when I was at school in South Africa, I had no African friends. There was no contact between white people living in South Africa at that time and African people on a basis of equality. It was all master and servant. And these were the days of apartheid. I just could not accept the idea that every white man was superior to every black man. I knew that this was just nonsense.
You cannot dominate a people without giving him a sense of inferiority. Racism is part of a colonial system. White supremacy was in exercise, was in practice in all the colonies.
As far as I was concerned, being able to get into the colonial service was exactly what I wanted, because I thought and I knew that the British government had the right idea towards Africa and Africans, and I wanted to have a normal relationship because I loved Africa.
Black men and white men were not equal, even if they were all citizens. There was a limit.
As Africa was brought under colonial rule, the lines etched on a map at Berlin were now drawn on the ground. Between them, Britain and France had the lion's share of territory. Among Britain's colonies were key ports in Egypt, the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and Nigeria, and settler colonies in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Excluding Libya, France controlled the rest of Arabic-speaking North Africa, as well as large federations in West and Central Africa. Belgium had taken the vast Congo. Colonies taken by Spain, Italy, Portugal and Germany were relatively few, and only Ethiopia and Liberia remained autonomous.
It was difficult to explain how people who made so much money in the slave trade, the bourgeois ports of England or France and so on, for hundreds of years they invested in it, suddenly found that what we are doing is despicable. Something happened. You only can explain that because the imperatives have changed. They wanted now to have access to the resources.
The 19th century abolition of slavery in Africa failed to bring freedom. Instead, once colonial armies had expelled the slave traders, people began to realize they simply had new masters to serve. Gold and diamonds, cocoa, ivory, rubber and cotton. Intensive exploitation swept through the continent as Africa delivered on its promises of untold riches bound for the dockyards of Europe. By the end of the 19th century, it had helped crown Britain the powerhouse of manufacturing, with a massive share of world exports, half of all cotton goods and 80% of all clothing. The French built their business plan on two materials crucial to industrial Europe, groundnut and cotton. But in colonizing the Sahara and staffing an elaborate administration, they struggled to see profits. France didn't simply want to rule an area, they wanted to assimilate a population. African towns were remodeled to replicate Dijon or Marseille. And the more French a person became, the better their chances in life. It was an attitude to Africans that they were proud of. But even the gift of citizenship wasn't quite what it seemed.
I remember I come from a family in which we don't speak French. But when we went to the elementary school, we had to learn French. So during the first year, to be honest with you, we just remained quiet. We learned how to recite the alphabet, and bit by bit we learned some French word because it was forbidden to speak the mother language.
The French ideal of cultural assimilation proved grossly misjudged. The colonies were founded by French military men to the exclusion of existing leaders. Their heavy-handed rule often created grievances among African subjects. But remote communities in places like Chad were able to evade the daily influence of French rule altogether. Only in Senegal, the seat of French West Africa, did a privileged few find a political voice. If the goal of building France in Africa succeeded in bricks and mortar, it largely failed in hearts and minds.
The contact was a contact of inequality. In other words, we were made to believe as if we had no civilization, no culture. That was very traumatizing indeed.
While the British rejected the French policy of cultural colonization, it still often happened in practice.
For my father's generation, the relationship with England was completely uncritical, uncomplicated. They went to church, they had a British education, they loved Shakespeare, they listened to the BBC World Service, and they were just, they spoke English with a clipped, actually, English accent, and they referred to England as a mother country, even though very few of them actually had the opportunity to travel to England.
Aside from the settler states, most British colonies saw only a small clique of British officials installed.
The main part of the job was to go out on village-to-village touring, and you'd go with the chief. You'd have meetings at villages.